Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and this is our Murders at KARLOV Manor set review. This video is the red cards in the set. We already did white, black, and blue, and I'm going to link those videos in the About section down below so that you can check those out after you're done with this one. We're just going to get right into it. So we're starting here with a sorcery. This is a rare. It's called Anzrag's Rampage. This is 2 red and 3. Destroy all artifacts you don't control. Then you get to exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. And you get to put any creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield, give it haste, and then at the end of the turn, the beginning of the next end step, it just comes back to your hand. So instead of just being exiled forever like you normally see with spells like this, it comes back to your hand and you can recast it, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of things this card does, and it's a little bit weird. So on first inspection, it probably works decently as a sideboard option if you're up against an artifact deck. If artifact decks become a really big thing in the meta, this could easily come in, wipe your opponent's artifacts, and get you value by getting a free big nasty onto the board, and that should be enough to just completely go over the top and win a game against an artifact-centric deck. But you can also just build around this and brew into it to try to cheat big things into play as, you know, the cornerstone of your deck. It's worth noting that it triggers off of all artifacts put into any graveyard from the battlefield this turn. So even your artifacts that you sacrifice before you play this will count. So in that way, you don't necessarily need to rely on your opponent having artifacts. You can, for example, play a bunch of treasures and sack a bunch of treasures, and then play this and get something big and nasty into play for free, swing with it, get another ETB that trigger the next turn when you replay it. Lots of value there, but then you still have the mana from the treasures that you sacked that can play another big spell the same turn. So there's definitely ways to really abuse this and go over the top, and it'll be interesting to see if anyone finds a way of making this kind of work as a way to cheat out stuff better than the other options that we have to cheat out stuff. There's a bunch of hoops to jump through, but if you can successfully jump through those hoops, I think it's possible to get even more value off a card like this, like at the ceiling, at the top end of the card, than your typical like cheat something into play card. Just because of the fact that the creature comes back to your hand and all of the artifacts you sacked, like for example the treasures, you still have all that mana. And there's just also wiping your opponent's artifacts in the process, just incidentally. Like, there's all this little edge value you can get from the card, and it'll be interesting to see if anyone actually does that with it. Moving on, we've got Bullrock Clan Basher. This is a 3/2 Cyclops warrior with double strike and trample for 2 red and 4. 6 is a lot of mana, but it does disguise. So for 3 mana, you can play it as a 2/2 with ward 2. And then at any time you can pay 2 red and 3 to unmask it, so to speak, flip it face up, and it becomes the 3/2 double strike trampler. So in that way, I actually think this guy is pretty good. It's worth noting that the disguise cost has double red, so it's not as easily splashable as most disguise creatures will be. But in the right deck, this can come up and absolutely blow out your opponent. 3/2 double striking trampler is nothing to sneeze at, especially when it's coming out as a surprise. So I think this is definitely a very main deckable card in limited decks. If you are in one of your main colors is red, it's not going to be splashable, but it is going to be a very aggressive play if you are able to actually play this as the disguise creature and use that disguise ability, because 6 mana to hard cast it is a lot, and that might be too much. Moving on, we've got Case of the Burning Masks. This is our first red case of the day. This is 2 red and 1. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature an opponent controls, so it's just straight up removal. And then to solve it, 3 or more sources you controlled have to have dealt damage this turn, which is a little interesting. Once it's solved, at any point after that, you can sacrifice the case, exile the top 3 cards of your library, choose one of them, and you may play that card this turn. So this is sort of an underrated piece of removal that if you can make it work and then get those conditions to line up, it turns into a little bit of extra card advantage on the back end, which is good. It's going to be good in limited. I do think there's better options for constructed, and that this card is just a little bit too build aroundy, too many hoops to jump through for it to be consistent enough for constructed. So I don't really see it being like the play for constructed, but in limited this card is going to be amazing. Any kind of removal with card advantage upside is going to be great in limited. So absolutely jam this in limited. It is worth noting it's double red, so you are going to have to be in red as one of your two main colors, which is really important. But yeah, really solid limited card. Moving on, we've got Case of the Crimson Pulse. This is not just a limited card, not at all. 1 red and 2. When it enters the battlefield, discard a card and then draw 2 cards. To solve it, you have to have no cards in hand at the end of your turn. And when it is solved, at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard your hand and then draw 2 cards. So right when you play it, you know, you're spending this card, so to speak, and discarding a card and drawing 2. So you're getting your 2 cards back. But where this really gets crazy is once it becomes solved. There's 2 things that I really want to point out. First of all, in order for it to become solved, you have to have no cards in hand, which means as soon as it becomes solved and you get to your trigger on your upkeep, you're not going to have cards in your hand to discard. So that trigger you should just read it as far as playability as you just draw 2 extra cards during your upkeep, which is kind of insane. Drawing 3 cards total a turn is bananas. But the other thing to keep in mind here is that activates every turn. It's not just once. It doesn't just trigger once when it's solved. And that just makes it bananas. Every single turn, you're drawing an extra 2 cards. And the only condition really at that point is you have to spend them that turn, because if they're still in your hand on your next turn, you have to get rid of them. But that shouldn't be too hard for red. I mean, being able to just play this in burn or anything that's low to the ground and just constantly vomit out 3 cards every single turn, just smash everything onto the field, you know, throw burn at your opponent's face if you have to. Like, this will close out a game really quick, and it still boggles my mind that this triggers every single turn. It's basically like a double Phyrexian Arena with no life loss condition. It's absurd. It's absolutely bananas. I love it. Play this. We're going to brew around it for sure. Moving on, we've got Caught Red-Handed. 1 red and 4 for an instant. It can't be countered. You gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn, and you suspect it. So this card is a little bit better than it looks. It's still expensive, and I don't know if it's worth running. But the important thing to take into account with this card is that it can't be countered. Therefore, when you use this to target a disguised creature or a cloaked creature, you don't have to pay the ward cost. So in that way, it's almost like this costs 3 instead of 5. And then you do have to pay the ward cost. It would be the same as that. So when you kind of think of it in that light, it's actually not that bad. And it's at instant speed. Normally we see a lot of these happen at sorcery speed. So getting this at instant speed, getting it so it can't be countered, and getting it so it still feels like a 3-mana spell if you're targeting Ward 2 creatures, which there's going to be a ton of in this set. All of that makes it a little better than it looks on first inspection. And then the fact that the creature that you steal also becomes suspected, so if they want to block it, they have to double block it. That's actually way better than we normally see on a card like this too, because normally you steal one thing and they have the option to just maybe chump it if they don't want to take a whole bunch of damage, or maybe just let it through if they don't want to lose a guy. But now, if they want to block it at all to not take damage, they can't just chump it, right? They got to put 2 guys in front of it. And if they only have one guy that is just a crappy 1/1 token, and the only other creature they have is an actual bigger relevant threat, forcing them to have to double block their best creature could be kind of backbreaking. So there's a lot about this card in particular that makes it deceptively good and way better than it appears on first inspection. That being said, it is still 5 mana. So I think you still want to try to play this in decks that are going to be able to get the most out of it. Maybe decks that have the ability to sacrifice things and get value, so that after you swing in, you can sacrifice the creature and your opponent won't get it back. But all in all, definitely a better card than I think people will give it credit for. Moving on, we've got Concealed Weapon. This is an equipment for 1 red and 1. It equips for 1 red and 1, and it gives equipped creature +3/+0. What's interesting about this one is it's also a creature, because you can just disguise it, play it as a disguised creature for 3 mana, comes in as a 2/2 ward 2, and then at any point you want, you can just pay 1 red and 2 and flip it into the equipment. And when Concealed Weapon is turned face up, you attach it to target creature you control. So you could do some really cool combat shenanigans with this, like swing in as a creature when this is disguised, and then like maybe they block this and they don't block your other creature, but then haha, gotcha, you flip it, they didn't kill your 2/2 guy because they blocked it, because now it's not a creature and no longer being blocked. But the other guy that got through gets this thing equipped to it right away, hits in for an extra 3 damage, or maybe something that got blocked by a really nasty threat gets this equipped, and then you're able to kill it when otherwise you wouldn't be able to. So you could do some really cool combat tricks with this, and it's especially tricky because it can just come out of being a creature, just become not a creature anymore at any point in time. So you could do stuff like chump block and then not lose the thing because you just unmask it, pay the disguise cost. So very, very tricky. And another one of those cards where if you don't have any creatures, you can just play this as a creature and just keep it as a creature, so it's not as useless under certain conditions where equipment might be useless if you're out of creatures per se. So I think this card is pretty usable. I think they're finding really interesting and effective ways to make equipment more useful, especially in limited. And I'm excited to definitely use this guy in my limited deck. Moving on, we've got Connecting the Dots. This is 1 red and 1 for an enchantment, and it basically turns all of your creatures into Beaumont Couriers. It's kind of insane. Whenever a creature you control attacks, you exile the top card of your library face down. It's important to note this triggers on every single creature that attacks. It doesn't just trigger once a turn, and it triggers on attack, not on dealing combat damage, which means it doesn't matter if your opponent blocks, kills your creature, whatever, like you're still exiling a card for every single creature that attacks. Then, at any point in time, you can pay 1 red and 1, discard your hand, and sacrifice Connecting the Dots, put all the cards exiled with it into their owner's hands. So, this is just a super easy way for a very aggressive, creature-based, go-wide deck to just completely refill their hand. You just vomit out all of your creatures onto the field, start swinging away, and then even if they shore up a defense and can block effectively, slam Connecting the Dots, swing with like 5 guys, exile 5 things. Even if they kill half of your dudes, then you just pay 2 and draw 5 cards. Like, it seems kind of insane. So this will absolutely see play in things like mono red. It'll probably see play in dual colored like aggro decks. You're just gonna want a lot of creatures. Any deck that's running a lot of creatures and going especially wide with creatures is gonna be able to make very, very good use of a card like this. Obviously, you just jam it in limited because it's just so much gas that unless you're not in an aggressive deck, you can probably just win the game if you manage to draw it. Next up, we've got Convenient Target. This is 1 red for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you suspect the enchanted creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and you can pay 1 red and 2 and return Convenient Target from your graveyard to your hand. That's kind of a lot to unpack. Just 1 mana for all of this versatility is pretty good. Like, one of your dudes, if you're on the offensive, can be given Menace, can be given +1/+1. You can get through a lot easier and do even more damage because it's bigger, and then if they do block it and kill it, this can just come back. And that's really great because they have to double block it because of the Menace. So they have to commit a lot of resources to just blocking and getting rid of the guy that has this just for you to get it back and just put it on another guy. So it's going to be a constant nuisance if you're able to stay aggressive. If you're the kind of deck that's trying to play defensively, maybe set up a defensive line and wait for your flyers to draw into your flyers and use those to win, something like that. Card like this, not going to work out. You need to be super aggressive to make it work, but the fact that it just keeps coming back and adding pressure, as long as you are able to race your opponent effectively, is pretty gnarly. It's also worth noting you can put this on your opponent's creature, and then, like, yeah, they gain Menace, but they can't block. So it's possible that if you top deck this at a key point in the game where there's just a very specific creature on their side you need to make sure can't block so that you can swing in for the win, you can just toss this on that and then get there. Like maybe you've got a flyer in the air and they've got just one flyer and you need your flyer to get through. I guess in that case you could just give your own flyer menace, so probably wouldn't be worth using, but I'm sure there are situations where you'd want to just, as long as it's going to actually win you the game, target their creature to make it so it can't block. Moving on, we've got Cornered Crook. This is 1 red and 4 for a 5/4 Viashino Warrior. When he enters the battlefield, you may sack an artifact. If you do, he deals 3 damage to any target. Pretty good. As long as you're in a deck that's got enough artifacts, that's in maybe like the clue token strategy or whatever. This is basically what? This is basically a 𝐒𝐿𝑒 in a way. It does 1 less damage, but the body is significantly better and for only 1 more mana. So, I mean, having a 𝐒𝐿𝑒 that you just have to have an artifact, any kind of artifact token or whatever to sacrifice in order to trigger is, I think, pretty good as far as limited is concerned, this being an uncommon. And the body's really good too. A 5/4 for 5 that has this sort of ability that can just remove another threat when it comes into play is going to be really good. Now, it's only going to work if you consistently have the artifacts to sack to it. So if you're in a deck that's doing that and you're confident you're going to be able to do that, you should absolutely try and pick this guy up, run him as your top end. But outside of that, if you're not able to consistently get that trigger and get that 3 damage to any target when he enters the battlefield, I don't think he's really worth playing, because if it's just the 5/4 body, that's pretty bad. So be careful in how you build your deck. Next up, we've got Crime Novelist. This guy is bananas. This is probably the best uncommon in the set, and honestly probably one of the best constructed cards in the set, even though it's only uncommon, which is kind of nuts. So 1 red and 2 for a 1/3 Goblin Bard. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add 1 red. Now, this is bananas. The most important part of this card is the fact that it turns your treasures into mini Black Lotuses. Like, treasures now sacrifice for 1 mana of any color and 1 red. They give you 2 mana, and that's just crazy. Am I the only one who's realizing this? The fact that this gets a +1/+1 counter every time you sack an artifact is just gravy. The fact that this can eventually build up into a huge body and just be another thing that you can maybe close the game out with is just extra and gravy. But the fact that you're getting a bunch of mana whenever you're sacking your artifacts, whether they're treasure tokens or not, is just crazy. And I feel like there's tons of applications in Constructed for this. Obviously, it's still going to be pretty good in Limited, but in Limited you have to be very careful to make sure you're building around it properly. You need to be in the Clue deck or the Artifacts Matter deck. You really need to be able to get at least a few triggers off this consistently to really make it worth it. If you can get 2 triggers off this guy, he becomes a 3/5, and at that point a 3 mana 3/5 that got you a couple extra points of a couple points of mana along the way as well is pretty good. But if you can't get those consistent sacrifices, it's probably not worth running. So don't just windmill slam this thing and then not worry about how consistent you can actually activate it. You want to make sure that if you're playing this, you are tilting your deck in the direction of that archetype so that you can get the most out of a card like this. But yeah, in Constructed, bananas, man. The things that are going to happen with this card in all Constructed formats across the board is going to be nutty, and I'm looking forward to brewing with it in Standard for sure. Next up, we've got Demand Answers. 1 red and 1 for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to sacrifice an artifact or discard a card. You draw 2 cards. This is just a strictly better version of a spell like this. We get a spell like this pretty much every set, but the fact that instead of just discarding a card to draw 2, add instant speed for 2 mana, which is normally what we get, we also just kind of have the upside of, if we want, we can sack an artifact instead. So it's just strictly better. And that's pretty awesome. I mean, sometimes we've just got a random artifact sitting around that we don't really need too much, and at that point, we don't have to worry about discarding anything. This is just a instant speed 2 mana draw 2, which is kind of bananas. I like that it can do both modes so that whatever works best for you in the situation is what you can use. And I think that's what makes this card pretty good. Definitely worth considering for your limited deck. Next up, we've got Expedited Inheritance. I'm not a big fan of this card. This is 2 red mana for an enchantment. Whenever a creature is dealt damage, its controller may exile that many cards from the top of their library. They may play those cards until the end of their next turn. So the problem here is that the ability is symmetrical. So like, sure, when your creatures are dealt damage, you're going to be able to exile cards and get basically card draw, card advantage off of that. But also whenever your opponent's stuff is dealt damage, they get to get card advantage. And since you're deep into red because you're playing a 2 mana double red pip spell, the chances of you using damage-based removal are much higher than your opponent. So if your removal is going to let them draw cards and they're just playing like black or white removal and it's not damage-based removal and it doesn't let you draw cards when they kill your stuff, you're just at a disadvantage. So I'm not super keen on this card. The one thing I do kind of like about it that I would consider using it in is if there is a prominent mill strategy that ends up becoming a thing and constructed somehow, and you know, red is one of the colors in that deck, you could run Expedited Inheritance as not only a way to get some card advantage, but a way that, like, if the opponent actually utilizes the card advantage from the damage dealt, exiles stuff to play, they're actually hurting themselves as well because they're getting themselves closer to being milled out. And so if you can make that matter for your deck, them exiling the cards and getting that much closer to having 0 cards in their deck, maybe it is worth using this, and then it puts your opponent in a very sticky situation where they have to make a decision about, like, do they not get card advantage when their opponent is? But do they, you know, do they take the chance that they're going to get milled out a lot quicker? It's very interesting conundrum, and I wonder if a deck like that will pop up. Next up, we've got Expose the Culprit. This is 1 red and 1 for an instant. Choose one or both. You either turn target face down creature face up, or exile any number of face up creatures you control with Disguise in a face down pile, shuffle that pile, and then cloak them. There's a lot of nuance to this card that's really easy to miss. So the obvious use is like, oh, you're playing with a bunch of Disguise creatures that have really cool like abilities that trigger when you flip them up. And so like, you draw this later in the game, and now you flip them all face down again, so you can flip them all up again and get all that value all over again. That's cool. Or it's a way to go, oh, I've got this really big, nasty Disguise guy on the field, but I don't have enough mana to flip it up yet. You can flip it up early and kind of cheat it into play by using Expose the Culprit on it. That's cool. Those are the 2 obvious ways to use it, right? But there's a couple ways of using this that are really interesting and overlooked. So you can turn any face down creature face up, even your opponent's. So if you want to not let them catch you with their pants down, if they're swinging in and you're considering blocking and it could really make the difference in the game and you just need to know what the hell it is that's swinging in, you could turn it face up and then make an informed block because of that. Also, the whole turn a bunch of creatures face down again with Disguise, there's a little bit of extra value in that too, because if a creature has a very expensive Disguise cost, but they have a very inexpensive mana cost, those creatures that get turned face down, they become cloaked. Even though it can only target creatures with Disguise, they technically become cloaked. And if a card is cloaked, it gains the ability, if it's a creature, to be turned face up just for its mana cost. So if you're running the right Disguise creatures, like I said, that have expensive Disguise costs, but very inexpensive mana costs, you could theoretically have the ability to then be able to flip up a bunch of creatures that get their when this card turns face up abilities triggered by spending a lot less mana and maybe happening a lot earlier in the game than you otherwise might be able to. So there's a lot of fringe ways to use this card that I think are interesting. It's kind of hard for me to evaluate this because of that. I think it's going to take some testing, but definitely don't ignore it because there's potential here, especially in limited, to just completely go off the rails and do some pretty wild things. So keep it in the back of your mind and we'll test it out come launch. Next up, we've got Felonius Rage, 1 red mana for an instant. Target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. I like that this can be used in multiple ways. The fact that it gives haste means if you just need to get in for damage, you can just play it on your creature, you know, pre-combat main phase to make it be able to swing in right away with an extra 2 power just by spending the 1 mana. And just be super aggressive in that way. But you can also save this as a trick, so that if your opponent like blocks a dude, like now you just target it, give it the +2/+0, so that it can trade with the thing that blocked, and then you get a 2/2 detective left over as well, so you get some value. So it's a really cool trick as well. The one unfortunate thing about this card is you can't really use it as a trick and get that kind of like blowout payoff, and also utilize the haste. They kind of like, they're almost like different modes, because the haste is useless if you're saving this as a trick, right? Except for maybe fringe cases where maybe you're chump blocking with something that just came into play, and then like giving it haste because it has some kind of a tap ability that you can use or whatever. Like it's possible you could get some value off that, but most of the time you're gonna kind of want to you know, pick one of 2 ways of playing this, which is just like be super aggressive, give my guy haste and +2 attack, or use it as a combat trick so I can kill their dude and get a 2/2 left over. But that versatility does make it pretty good. Definitely keep your eye on it for limited. Next up, we've got Frantic Scapegoat. This guy is absolutely hilarious, and I'm going to take a quick coffee break. Made it 26 minutes in this time. 1 red mana for a 1/1 goat with haste. Seems okay to start. When it enters the battlefield, suspect it. So it's a 1/1 menace haste for 1, which is actually pretty good, to be honest. Whenever 1 or more other creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if Frantic Scapegoat is suspected, you may suspect one of the other creatures, and then if you do, Frantic Scapegoat is no longer suspected. This guy is way better than he looks. The fact that he's coming down on turn 1, swinging for a damage with menace, can't be blocked. He's getting in for 2, 3, maybe 4 damage before your opponent actually has enough blockers that they'd consider blocking this guy. And by that point in the game, you just have a better creature come into play, and you're like, you know what? This big nasty thing that just came into play, I'm just going to give that haste instead. And what's cool about that is you don't lose your scapegoat. Like, you still have a 1/1 creature chilling that you can chump block with if you need to. You can sacrifice to sacrifice outlets to get value. Like, you still have this body kicking around, but then you also have menace on like your best creature when it's swinging in. So I think the value of being able to get in for early damage with this, but then like give something way better menace later on and still have this body left over, like those 2 things combined, I think really makes this worth considering, even for constructed in something like mono red control, or mono red aggro rather. I just think the card is really good. I think the ability to give your best creature menace on a later turn without sacrificing the scapegoat, still having the body, just makes it kind of nutty. So definitely try this in aggressive decks and constructed. And as far as limited go, I think it's a really good limited card too, to be completely honest. It's going to be better if you're aggressive, but even if you're not a super aggressive deck, the fact that you get to choose when you give menace to something else and what you give it to means you don't have to do it on a turn where it might hurt you, where you need to be playing blockers that can effectively hold off an opponent's aggro deck. You don't have to give the creature, you don't have to suspect it and give it the menace and make it so it can't block. You can choose to do it when it works for you. So I think it's going to be pretty good and limited too. Keep it in mind. Moving on, we've got Fugitive Codebreaker, 1 red and 1 for a 2/1 Goblin Rogue with both prowess and haste. That's pretty powerful in and of itself. Disguise for 1 red and 5. This cost is reduced by 1 for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard, and when it's turned face up, you discard your hand and then draw 3 cards. So this is one of the few disguise guys that's really good in either mode, whether you're just hard casting it for 2 and using it as an aggressive creature, or actually disguising it at some point in the game and then flipping it. It's really good on both modes. And in fact, if you're playing this in an aggro deck, Like, if you have it early, you want to play it on 2 and just be aggressive with it. 2/1 haste that's going to get pumped up every time you cast a non-creature. Don't even worry about the value of, you know, disguising it and then unmasking it later. But then when you draw another copy a little bit later in the game, when you have more mana and when you're running out of gas in your hand, that second copy can now be played completely differently from the first, where you just play it in for 3, and if you've played enough instants and sorceries, you could even flip it that same turn for just 1 extra mana. So pay a total of 4 mana, you get a 2/1 prowess haste that can swing in, but you're also drawing 3 cards. And granted, you have to discard your hand, but you just don't flip it until you're out of cards, right? So the idea here is, if you don't need to draw cards because you have cards in your hand, you just play those. But as soon as you run out, you flip it, you draw 3, and getting to do that for a total of 4 mana and have a 2/1 prowess haste on top of it is pretty good. So whichever way you use it, I think this guy's going to be pretty gnarly. He's going to be super good in, like, is it Spellslinger style decks? The one thing worth noting here is I do think he's going to work best in a deck that is predominantly instants and sorceries. So I don't know if he slots into traditional mono red aggro. He still might be good enough just as a 2-drop that the other stuff is just gravy. But I'm thinking he might not make the cut. It's hard to say for sure, but definitely in a Spellslinger style deck, 100%. Jam this guy and play it. In limited, he's going to be great in any kind of aggressive deck. Even if you're not able to activate that disguise ability until much later in the game, and it's inefficient, it's still a way to just draw cards on top of an aggressive creature. So definitely worth slamming in limited as well. Next up, we've got Galvanize. This is another good example of how commons are completely playable in this set, more so than I think in any set we've gotten before this. 1 red and 1 for an instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature, and if you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it deals 5 damage to that creature instead. There's a lot of versatility here. It's a lot easier to hit that 2 cards in a turn if you play it on your turn, and you lose some of the versatility of it being an instant if you're playing it on your turn, almost like a pseudo sorcery. But it's a lot easier to hit that, you know, stipulation of drawing 2 cards because you've already drawn 1 on your draw step. So you can just use this to kill something with 3 toughness if you need to, or you can use it sorcery speed style to do 5 to something in a turn where you can just draw 1 extra card somehow, whether it be a clue token or whatever. Or you can get the god setup of you have a way to draw 2 cards on your opponent's turn. Maybe you've got 6 mana and you've got 2 clues to crack or whatever, and you can still use this at instant speed as a combat trick to kill a 5 toughness creature because you're able to draw those 2 cards. So there's sort of 3 different modes in a way, and different ways to use this, which I think has a lot of versatility for just a common piece of removal. So you're absolutely going to want to consider running this in your limited deck. There's so much good removal in this set that I don't know if it makes the cut over some of the other removal, to be completely honest, but it's definitely good enough to be in contention. So feel free to grab it. Feel free to grab some coffee. Delicious. This is Bane orangutan. Bane. This is 𝐂𝐀𝐕𝐈𝐻's cousin. This is 1 red and 2 for a 2/2 ape with reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. You either destroy up to 1 target artifact, or you sacrifice an artifact, and if you do, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on Bane orangutan. I think this guy is great. The potential to be a 4/4 reach for just 3 mana makes it main deckable, while being able to destroy up to 1 target artifact as an alternate mode means it's a way to sneak in what would normally be in your sideboard into your main deck. So if you're able to draft a limited deck where you have enough artifacts to make the ability to turn this into a 4/4 reach for 3 consistently, you definitely want to slam this, and then just keep in mind that you have this alternate mode that if it's better for you to take out a key artifact that's super important for them, you can just do that instead. But I love that it's stapled to just a good body, a good creature that can just be that if that's what you need it to be. So as far as commons go, This guy's awesome. A+. Next up, we've got Goblin Maskmaker. 1 red mana for a 1/2 Goblin Citizen. Whenever he attacks, face down spells you cast this turn cost 1 less to cast. Pretty cool card. I do think it's a little bit of a trap for Constructed, because at most, I think you're only going to be able to swing in with this once, get that 1 cost reduction, and then they're probably going to block and kill this thing, right? So the fact that he has to attack in order to enable this cost reduction, and his body is so small with no survivability, makes it really tricky to get multiple uses off this. And so because of that, I do think it's a bit of a trap in Constructed. I think when you first see it, the idea is like, oh man, like maybe Disguise can be a valid archetype in Constructed because of this guy. If all your Disguise creatures are coming down for 2 mana instead of 3, that's bananas, right? But I do think it's a bit of a trap. I think, you know, you swing once, you get 1 thing to come in on turn 2 as a Disguise creature instead of turn 3, and then this thing just dies, and then that's it. So I don't know if it works in Constructed. In Limited, it's going to be great. It's super easy to just splash a bunch of different Disguise creatures in your deck. And if you can double down on Disguise mechanics and Disguise synergies, like this guy's just kind of an auto-include, and it's a lot easier to get multiple triggers off of him, make your stuff cost a lot less. So I think he's going to be pretty cool in Limited. I think he's a bit of a trap in Constructed, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, Harried Dronesmith. 1 red and 3 for a 2/3 human artificer. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. It gains haste until end of turn, and you have to sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step. This guy is a little bit overcosted, but I also think he's really good. Like, getting a 2/3 body and a 1/1 flyer, you're basically getting 3 power, 4 toughness, 4 mana with one of those bodies, like spread across 2 bodies, and one of those bodies has flying. So the numbers are there and the versatility is there. The thing that is really a little rough is the fact that you have to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step every time. But you can utilize these Thopters for different sacrifice abilities, use it as gas to fuel things, like the orangutan that we talked about recently. So constantly having an artifact every turn to sacrifice and generating another one the next turn to be able to sacrifice again, that ability is super valuable. So if you take that into account, if you're in the type of deck that's just constantly looking for artifacts to sacrifice for value, and it seems like there's multiple cards in this set that want that, then this guy's actually going to be really good. So in a vacuum, it's just kind of okay. You know, it might make the cut as your 21st, 22nd, 23rd card. But if you are in a deck that is looking for artifacts to sacrifice, this thing's a slam dunk, because not only is it going to be a body itself and give you an artifact every single turn to sacrifice so that you don't have to actually sacrifice valuable artifacts, but also that 1/1 Thopter gets to swing in before you sacrifice it. So it's also an extra little ping, which does add up. So in that deck in particular, in that archetype, this guy is super valuable. This girl is super valuable. Definitely don't count this card out if you're in that sort of a deck, because it's going to be a slam dunk. Next up, Incinerator of the Guilty. 2 red and 4 for a 6/6 flying trampled dragon. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may collect evidence X. And when you do, Incinerator of the Guilty deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker that player controls. So this ability is super powerful. The fact that you can do a one-sided board wipe, you're always going to have like some amount of cards in your graveyard by the time this guy makes it onto the battlefield, right? So like, at the very least, you're going to be able to consistently activate it once, typically, or else you're not building your deck right. And that once can be for 5, 6, 7 mana worth of stuff if you need to. And you just one-sided board sweep. The thing I don't like about this, the 2 points I want to bring up that make me a little hesitant. First of all, doesn't have haste. So it's a 6 mana thing that has to actually survive an entire turn cycle before you can do the thing. So it's probably going to die. And that's a bit of a bummer. The other thing that's worth noting is it's a 6/6 flying trampler, And this ability activates when it swings in and has to connect and deal combat damage to a player. If you're connecting and dealing combat damage to a player with a 6/6 flying trampler, like, the game's almost over anyway. So do you really need to wipe their side of the board? I mean, there will definitely be fringe cases where you do need to, and it could make the difference between winning the game or not. But most of the time, if you're able to actually swing in with this, and they can't stop it, they can't remove it, they can't block it effectively, and you're able to actually deal damage, like, you're already winning, and you're probably going to win the game with just this guy over the next couple turns anyway. So sweeping the board seems a little iffy. Now, if we were able to give him haste, maybe I change my tune on it, because that means out of nowhere he can swing in when our opponent isn't ready for him, doesn't know he's coming, and getting that, you know, one-sided board sweep off on a turn like that before he has the ability to kind of like plan for it and try to stop it is a lot more relevant. So I'm not 100% sure how I would want to use this guy, but that being said, he is super powerful. So there's definitely a deck out there, probably a Dragon Tribal deck, that wants to try this guy and see if he can work. And if there's a way to give him haste efficiently and effectively, he's going to be that much better. So interesting card. It'll be interesting seeing if anybody's able to really put this to good use come launch. Next up, we've got Innocent Bystander. 1 red and 1 for a 2/1 Goblin Citizen. Whenever he's dealt 3 or more damage, you get to investigate. Very interesting card. You can block and trade with something. Trade with like a 3/2 and investigate and get a clue token. Most of the time, that's what he's going to do. He's going to come down as a 2/1 body for 2. He's going to do the normal thing that, you know, 2/1 bodies do. But then there's a chance that eventually when he dies, whether he gets blocked or you chump block with him or whatever, there's a chance that you can investigate, especially if you're chump blocking like their big nasty that's swinging in. And then you get a clue token to replace him. So in that scenario, he's actually not so bad. You know, he helps you fill out your curve and replaces himself when he dies, as long as you're careful in how you use him. But I think what could really make this card pretty gnarly is if you have a way to give it indestructible or something to that effect, and you can just keep investigating whenever he's dealt damage. That could be pretty wild. I don't know exactly the best and most efficient way to do that, or if it's even worth jumping through that hoop, but it is something that's pretty cool that's worth considering. Next up, we've got Knife. It's just 1 red mana for a clue equipment. It equips for 2. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and first strike on your turn only. And you can pay 2 and sacrifice the knife to draw a card. Really good for aggressive decks. Again, this is one of those clue equipments that's a lot better than normal equipments, because if you don't have any creatures, if you're out of gas, you can just sack it to draw a card, try to get to your next creature. So all of these clue equipments are a lot better than normal equipments, a lot more playable in limited because of that. But this one specifically wants to be in a very aggressive deck, because if you're not able to effectively race your opponent and you have to get defensive, this thing literally does nothing. At that point, you still can sack it to draw a card, but you don't want to have to utilize the plan B, right? You want to set yourself up for plan A to work as often as possible. So this one does have to go in just the right deck, but in that deck, I think it's a perfectly valid inclusion. Next up, we've got Clanco, Baron of Tin Street, as well as a swig of my coffee. Nectar of the Gods. 1 red and 2 for a 3/3 legendary goblin. It has haste. You can tap it and sack an artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. And whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 red. If you do, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains haste until end of turn. This guy is going to be pretty interesting. He obviously works super well with all of the other artifact synergies that we've seen in red. Things that want to sacrifice artifacts, things that get value off of sacrificing artifacts. But what's cool here is you get a 1/1 every time an artifact's put into the graveyard by just paying the red. So, for example, if you sacrifice a treasure for a red mana, the sacrifice triggers and says, hey, do you want to pay a red to make a goblin? And you go, well, that's convenient because I just made a red mana with my treasure. You use that red, you get a goblin. So basically all of your treasures can just automatically convert into goblins with haste if you want, which is kind of cool. And then if you have some of the other artifact sacrifice synergies like Crime Novelist on the field, you can get even more crazy value out of that. But then the fact that he's also just got this ability to tap himself and sacrifice an artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin is also kind of wild. If you have like 5 treasures and a clue token, you could just like sack all your treasures for red mana, make 5 1/1 goblins with haste, and then tap this guy, sack the clue token, put +1/+1 counters on all of them, including itself. It's worth noting that a counter goes on Clanco as well, and then you're like swinging with 5 2/2s, and that seems kind of powerful. So I think there's a lot of shenanigans you can do with this guy. I don't know if he's fast enough to make the cut, considering how much you have to be in that archetype and how much you have to really double down on that synergy to make this guy worth it. But even at the end of the day, just a 3/3 haste for 3 is kind of fine. So he might get there. There might be an artifact goblin synergistic weird tribal deck in Constructed, in Standard specifically, that could make good use of this guy and really go off the rails, and we're gonna have to experiment. I definitely want to experiment with him. In Limited, he's a slam dunk. You just grab him and you get a bunch of value off him, and he's absolutely worth playing. Next up, we've got Cranko's Buzz Crusher. People seem to be buzzing about this card not being good, which is weird to me. This is a 4/4 flying trample for 2 red and 2. It's an artifact creature, Insect Thopter. When it enters the battlefield, for each player you can destroy up to 1 non-basic land that player controls, and for each land destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So here's the thing. Normally the ability to do that costs 3 mana in and of itself. Something like a Field of Ruin, you have to pay 2 mana to activate it, but then the Field of Ruin itself is also a land that you have to tap in order to use that ability. So it's sort of like it uses 3 mana, right, to activate a Field of Ruin. This is just 1 more mana than that. For 1 extra mana, you also get a 4/4 flying trampling artifact creature, which just seems like insane rate to me. So if you're in a deck that wants to include a Field of Ruin style effect for some reason, I think this guy's a slam dunk. That being said, Field of Ruin does slot into the mana base, so it's kind of a free card in a way. You don't have to use up your limited real estate for business cards, whereas with this card you kind of do. It doesn't slot into your mana base like Field of Ruin, but I don't know. I feel like he might be good enough. It's also worth noting that you have the option of hitting yourself or not. So whereas with Field of Ruin, you know, you have to sack your land and then search for a land. With this, you can choose to destroy or not destroy one of your lands to find another one, which means you can like enable landfall. If you're in a deck that cares about landfall, there's a little bit of edge value you can maybe get there, or you can like maybe mana fix yourself. There's a lot of little bits of edge value baked into this, but I think at the end of the day, if you're in a deck that can make use of a Field of Ruin style ability, this guy's just gnarly, because if that's what you want, it's basically a 4/4 flying trample for 1 extra mana. It's also worth noting that it triggers every time he enters the battlefield, so if you flicker the Buzz Crusher, it can get kind of gnarly. Next up, we've got Lamplight Phoenix. Now, this isn't the best Phoenix we've ever seen, but I do think this is a lot better than the last couple that we got. This is a 3/3 flying Phoenix for 2 red and 1. When he dies, you may exile it and collect evidence 4. If you do, return Lamplight Phoenix to the battlefield tapped. Now, it's important to note you have to choose this right away as soon as it dies. If you don't have the evidence 4 to collect right when it dies, you cannot bring it back from the battlefield, ever. At least not with its own ability. That being said, you don't have to exile it, right? It's a may, so if you don't have 4 evidence to collect, you can choose not to exile it and let it go to your graveyard like normal. If you have a different way of bringing it back later in the game, you can bring it back, and then if it dies again, maybe now you do have the collect evidence 4, right? And now you can bring it back that way. So it's worth noting that the fact that you don't have to exile it no matter what, and then only return it if you collect evidence 4, you get to choose whether it gets exiled or not, is valuable. There is some edge value to be had there if you have other ways in your deck of bringing creatures back. But this just coming back over and over and over and over and over by collecting evidence for is kind of gnarly. You could run this in a Spellslinger deck. And what's cool about this too is it doesn't have to just be used aggressively, right? If you need to be able to block and trade with one of their flyers, you can still bring this back afterwards. Red wants to be aggressive, so I don't see that coming up as often, but it is another way to use this card, and it's pretty cool. So I think this guy's pretty decent. It's just a 3/3 flyer that they're going to have a lot of trouble keeping gone forever. So next up, Offender at Large, 1 red and 4 for a 5/4 giant rogue with disguise 1 red and 4. So the disguise cost is the same as its normal mana cost. But when Offender at Large enters the battlefield or is turned face up to 1 target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Now, this isn't that great, but it is a common, so it kind of makes sense. The fact that its disguise cost and its normal cost are the exact same, and it gets the extra ability no matter what, is a little bit weird. But in a deck that's splashing red, I could see this making sense because early in the game, if you don't have your red mana yet, you can just play it as a 2/2 ward 2 for 3 colorless. And then later on, if you happen to draw your red, well, now you can, you know, flip it up and get a little bit of extra value out of it. So it's kind of valuable in that way, in being able to like splash disguise creatures that like maybe get some incidental value later on. But at the end of the day, it's just a common. It's going to be your 23rd card if you're running out of playables, right? Next up, we've got Person of Interest. This is 1 red and 3 for a 2/2 human rogue. When it enters the battlefield, you suspect it, and then you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. I think this guy's a little bit better than he looks. 4 mana for 4/4 worth of power toughness spread across 2 bodies, and even though one of those bodies can't block, it has Menace, and the other one can block. So it's pretty interesting, you know, a 2/2 Menace and another 2/2 for 4 mana. Seems pretty okay for common. I don't think this would be super good at a higher rarity, but at common, this is a very easy way to kind of fill out your deck. And it gives you detectives for Detective Tribal as well, so that's not nothing. I kind of like this. Again, I don't think it's amazing. It is one of those filler cards, but as far as filler cards go, you could do a lot worse. Next up, we have Pyrotechnic Performer, 1 red and 1 for a 3/2 Viashino Assassin. The fact that this is just a 3/2 for 2 mana is pretty decent in and of itself. It can just be an aggressive creature no matter what. But it also has Disguise for just 1 red, which is kind of gnarly. Whenever it or another creature you control is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. This ability seems super powerful. All of your Disguise creature turning into just burn to the head seems kind of wild, and this guy gets even better in multiples. If you're able to flip up a second one, just that one flipping up alone is going to do 3 and 3 because of the other one in play and hit for 6. And then the next Disguise creature you flip up is doing double damage as well, so that can get pretty absurd. I almost wonder if we can brew something with cards that like are clones and can copy other creatures. If we can flip one of these up, copy it, and then just go to town with Disguise creatures, we could just end the game that way. Be really cool, like turtle up in a defensive deck that just wins without ever having to attack, right? And just flips all its guys up. Pretty interesting card, and I actually have a brew. I'm going to be running Assassin Tribal, and I think this guy's a perfect fit for Assassin Tribal, to be completely honest. I'm not going to give away the whole deck yet, but that deck's going to be wild, and I think this card is actually going to be a key inclusion because that deck's going to use a lot of cloaking. And the potential of cloaking a creature that's not supposed to normally be disguised, and then being able to turn that thing face up and get value off of this card and do a bunch of damage seems pretty interesting. So stay tuned, more to come. Next up, we've got Reckless Detective, 1 red and 1 for a 0/3 Devil Detective. Whenever it attacks, you may sack an artifact or discard a card. If you do, draw a card, and Reckless Detective gets +2/+0. So there's a lot of versatility here, and I think it makes this card actually super good. Like, you can just rummage, right? You can just discard a card to draw a card and swing as a 3/3. Like, you always have that option, and you're not going to have any card disadvantage whatsoever if you do that. because you're replacing the card that you discard. So if you think about it like that, it's just a 3/3 for 2 mana every time it swings, which is kind of cool. But then you also have this extra ability of, instead of discarding a card, you can sack an artifact, and that's where it gets really nutty, because if you have artifacts you don't mind sacrificing, now not only is this a 2 mana 3/3 that swings every turn, but it's a 2 mana 3/3 that draws you a card every turn if you have the fodder to sacrifice to it. So I think that's really powerful. Normally the downside of a card like this, of an ability like that, is the fact that when you don't have the artifacts, it's kind of useless and the consistency goes down, right? So the fact that it has this alternate mode where you can just rummage and you don't have any card disadvantage, so that even if you are in a situation where you don't have an artifact to sack, like, you can still swing with a 3/3, you can still get some value off this. I think that shores up its downsides and makes this card way more playable than he otherwise might be. So definitely jam him in the artifact deck, but even outside of the artifact deck, he might be fine just rummaging and attacking as a 3/3. Next up, we've got Red Herring, one of my favorite cards in the set as far as flavor is concerned. This is a 2/2 artifact creature Cluefish for 1 red and 1. It has haste. It has to attack each combat if able, and you can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card. So the downside to a card like this is it has to swing each combat if able, which means if they have a good blocker for it, you're kind of forced into a position where you have to sack it and draw a card, even if you can't really afford to take the tempo off to do that on that turn, because otherwise they're just going to block it and eat it, and it's going to be gone and you're going to get no value off of it. That being said, the fact that this can be an aggressive 2/2 haste for 2 that can get you card advantage later is pretty good in aggressive red decks, I'm not gonna lie. And the very first turn that you play it, you can get around having to attack by playing it on your second main phase, so that you can use it as a chump blocker that turn, and maybe you block and then in response sack it to draw a card, so maybe you even still get to draw the card. So there are some ways around it and some ways to use this card to get a little bit of utility, and I think that's pretty interesting. But at the end of the day, it really wants to be an aggressive decks where you're just trying to bring in the damage as quick as possible with creatures, and then hopefully you have this added upside of getting card advantage later on. I'm looking forward to kind of testing this in constructed in very aggressive decks. Not sure how it's going to go, but we're going to try. In limited, I think it's a little bit less playable, because there's so many more opportunities to be caught with your pants down in a situation where you really don't want to be swinging with this, and you're forced to sacrifice it, and it's not great in that scenario. But for the right constructed deck, I think this has the potential to be pretty insane. So we're going to try it. Moving on, we've got Rubble Belt Braggart. This is 1 red and 4 for a 5/5 Viashino Warrior. Whenever it attacks, if it's not suspected, you may suspect it. Kind of cool little filler card here. It's going to be like your 22nd, 23rd card in your limited deck. It's not going to make the cut for constructed, obviously. But it's cool that you can have your choice of a 5/5 that's just a 5/5 that can block for as long as it needs to. But then as soon as the game state changes where you're no longer on the defensive and you can start being aggressive and you can start racing your opponent, well, then you can choose to suspect it so that it gets menace. It just loses the ability to block. But the ability to have it be a blocker until you're ready to start trying to take over and close out the game, and at that point then you get the menace, kind of makes this guy a little bit better than he looks on the surface. So I would consider him as, you know, a way to fill out the deck if I'm low on playables as my 23rd card for sure. He could be really cool in just the right deck. Next up, we've got Shock. Shock is back. 1 red mana, instant speed, can remove something that's 2 toughness or less, can deal 2 damage to your opponent's head if you need to close out a game. It's going to absolutely be usable in limited. It's already usable in constructed. It is a staple. You will use this card. There's nothing else to say. I'm not shocked that it's in the set. Next up, we've got Suspicious Detonation. Suspicious Detonation. 1 red and 4 for a sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if you've sacrificed an artifact this turn. You don't have to sacrifice an artifact to it. You just have to have sacrificed an artifact already to something else. Also, the spell can't be countered no matter what, whether you sacrifice an artifact or not, and it deals 4 damage to target creature. So, best case scenario, this is 2 mana, sorcery speed, 4 damage to anything, can't be countered. Well, any creature can't be countered, which is really, really good. If you can consistently make that line happen, then this is going to be great. If you have to pay 5 for this, even with the uncounter ability, that's pretty rough. That being said, it is removal that is splashable, and it's at common, so there will be plenty of scenarios where you're drafting and maybe you find yourself a little light on removal because you've been prioritizing other things and it's towards the end of a pack, and you can just easily pick one of these up to kind of like make sure you at least have something, a plan B, so that if your deck ends up light on removal, you can run something like this. But if you're in a situation where you're running a deck that's using tons of artifacts to sacrifice, like the Clue deck, then I think this goes way up in value, and you can actually pick this a little higher. If you're able to consistently play this for 2 mana, then it's super good. So definitely keep that in mind. Next up, we've got the Chases On. 1 red and 2 for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. And you investigate. Now, this is a little more expensive than we're used to combat tricks like this being, but it does give you a lot more bang for your buck. Like, instant speed +3/+0 and first strike means you are killing their thing, and the first strike means you are surviving, and the instant speed means they are not seeing it coming. So that alone is already like huge tempo advantage, right? But the fact that this also investigates, so it replaces itself with another card draw later on because of the clue token, just makes this kind of nutty. I think this is way better than other people give it credit for. 3 mana is a lot, not gonna lie, but in limited, you can totally afford to just wait and use this as a combat trick later on in the game. And like +3/+0 is a lot when it's coupled with first strike. Like I said, you are going to almost always kill the thing you're in combat with and not die yourself, like no matter what, and get a card draw later on after that to replace this card. So that's just insane value in my mind, and I absolutely think this guy is super playable and way better than anyone else is giving it credit for, even though 3 mana is a little much. And next up, we've got Torch the Witness. 1 red and X. Sorcery. Deals twice X damage to target creature. If excess damage was dealt to that creature this way, you get to investigate. This is a great little removal spell. It's a removal spell that gives you extra value and card advantage later on. So like, if you play this just for 2 mana, it's going to do 2 to something. And if you happen to kill a 1/1 with that 2 mana, not that you normally want to, but if you do, you are doing excess damage, right? And you'll get a clue token. So 2 mana, kill a 1 toughness creature, get a clue token, seems pretty okay. You can kill your Thalias with that. There's a lot of 2/1 creatures in Standard that are going to hate to see that kind of a play line when you get extra value in the form of a clue token on top of it. But then being able to scale this, you know, if you pay a total of 3 mana, you're now doing 4 to something. You know, you're killing Rafine, or you're killing a 3/3 and getting a clue token. But it can scale all the way up. You can kill a Traxa with this. You can, you know, pay total of 4 mana and kill a Sheoldred with this, and do excess damage and get a clue token when you do that. So I think there's a lot of versatility here. It does get a little bit expensive to take out bigger threats, and there's a lot of other options in Standard for removal, for taking out bigger threats for a lot less mana. So in that way, it's kind of like a knock against it, and I don't know if it will see play over cards like that. But the fact that this is scalable and can get you card advantage, and like I said, can take out 2/1s for just 2 mana and get you a clue token is kind of wild. So it's possible that having that mode and the ability to scale way up to kill a big thing in the same card does put it over the top and makes it usable and constructed, but we're going to have to wait and see. It's tough to gauge that one. Definitely Windmill Slam it in limited. It's just remove their bomb and get a clue token is going to be amazing. And the last card in red is Vengeful Tracker. This is a 2/2 human detective for 1 red and 1. Whenever an opponent sacrifices an artifact, Vengeful Tracker deals 2 damage to them. This is better than I think most people give it credit for, because I think people are underestimating how many sacrificable artifacts are going to be in this format. Like, clue tokens are going to be everywhere. And in addition to clue tokens, there's going to be some other fringe stuff. alongside clue tokens that are sacrificable artifacts, or there's a lot of sacrifice artifact payoff in the set, and a card like this completely hoses a deck like that. So I think this is a little better than people are going to give it credit for. They're going to look at it in a vacuum. They're going to go 2/2 for 2 with an ability that's not going to trigger very often, like whatever. But I mean, if they're playing the Clue Tribe and they've got like 3 clues and you slam this, like they can't sack their clues without taking 6 damage. That's just nuts. That's just absolutely insane. And you still have a 2/2 for 2. So I think in Limited, this guy is absolutely at least worth considering. And depending on how the format shapes up and how prevalent clue tokens and other sacrifice artifact stuff is, this guy could be even better. So keep him in mind. He's no slouch. He's definitely pretty wild. And that's been my set review for the red cards and murders at Karlov Manor. Green is coming up next, and then after that will be colorless and multicolor. I will link all of that stuff in the about section of the video so that you can find those videos. And also, we do have a spoiler short playlist that I will link down below as well. So if you're interested in a specific card and you don't want to sit through these full set reviews, you can look up a certain card in that playlist and you can get a very quick 1-minute long video on that. And when all of these set review videos are done being put out, I'm also going to do top 10 constructed cards of the set, top 5 limited cards of the set, and I'm going to put out a video with the 10 decks I am the most excited about brewing. And you can use that video to inform yourself on voting if you are a patron. So if you'd like to join the Patreon, patreon.com/quarantinecapricorn, our lowest tier is just $1, just $1 whole dollar. And everyone that's even at the $1 tier can vote on what order I do all of my brews in as soon as this set launches. So if you really want to see specific brews and you really don't want to wait 2 weeks to finally get around to that one, we're going to be doing a new brew every single day, and you're going to get to vote on the order that we do those 10 decks over the first 10 days of the set being live. So definitely check that out on Patreon if you're interested, and look forward to Green coming up next. I'll see you guys there. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.